So, welcome back to Roland's Rant. Today, my guest is Steve Keen. Steve is an Australian economist and author. He's an expert in economics, obviously, and he's also written books such as New Economics and Debunking Economics as well. So, Steve, thanks a mil for taking time out to have a quick chat. And as I do with all my guests, I just tend to ask them how their day is going thus far.
You don't want to know. I seem to have a whole series of minor catastrophes that keep on hitting me. Yesterday's not so much minor catastrophe was my YouTube channel got hacked. So the good news is today it looks like Google's going to help me get out of that and revive my YouTube channel. The bad news is I went shopping and I left my keys on the auto scanner, so I'm now stuck without a set of keys to my house. So yeah, that's my own fault. Okay, but a lot of my little catastrophes seem to come out of left field. I feel like one of those robots being hit by people in to make sure they see how they handle when they get pushed over. So yeah, not good, but I'll survive.
It sounds like nearly a podcast episode in itself there, the trials and tribulations with Professor Steve Keen over the last couple of hours, but we'll leave that probably for another time. And
indeed,
like there's a huge extensive amount of research I could and have gone into for this conversation today, Steve, and it's, as I look at economics, I nearly compare it to something like food or nature. Like, it is absolutely so extensive and vast, and there's so many different takes you can have on it and the effects it obviously has on society and other areas of planet Earth. But how do you, and you've been in the area of economics now for decades, how do you condense economics into something that is an area that is worth devoting your time and energy towards, considering it is so vast and you could pick anything at any given time about economics?
Well, the starting point is we're dominated by a paradigm that should have failed a century ago. Okay, the conventional way of thinking about economics these days starts with supply and demand analysis, multi-market version they call general, and they put it all in equilibrium. And when you look at the foundations of this, which began back in the 1870s, that was an overthrow of a previous approach to economics, which did not use supply and demand, because in fact explicitly said supply and demand was a false way to look at the capitalist economy. That was Ricardo who made that case, and Smith. But ever since Marshall and Walras and Jevons, we've been working in terms of utility maximizing consumers facing profit maximizing firms, leading to a general state of equilibrium, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that the mathematics of that, anybody can draw two lines on a sheet of paper and say the action is where the point intersects. You've got to explain why the curves have the shape they do and whether you head towards equilibrium or not, whether the system is actually stable. Now, the attempts by neoclassical economists to prove that it was failed, and mathematicians by accident also showed that the concepts they use failed. But because the idea of capitalism as a utility maximizing, cost minimizing system was so seductive to so many people, that we've persisted on with that paradigm despite a century's worth of intellectual failures. So my advice is don't start with economics, learn something realistic. And that takes me to system dynamics, which is a modern approach that began in the 1950s about how we can use the capacity to computing to simulate systems. And we don't have to force the assumption of equilibrium anymore, which of course was a necessity in the 19th century. So economic theory, everything that people believe is useless. It should have been thrown out in the 1920s. The fact that it's persisted just shows how seductive that vision of capitalism is to so many people. But yeah, it's time to start all over again, and we can start all over again with the work of engineers and people working in complex systems. That should be the foundation of economics. But there's so much detritus, so many false beliefs based on those 19th century notions that we are. The economy would be a damn sight better off if there were no economists. Let's summarize it that way.
All right. And the aspect of economics that I find rather interesting, and you somewhat touched on it there, where economics, you can maybe compare it to the political landscape, even maybe religion, science. As time goes on, new ideas come in, new failures get unearthed, and as you said, you may need to adapt and modernize your views. But like, how important is one's background when it comes to their eventual or current view on economics? So what I mean by that is, will a certain country lend itself towards a specific type of economic belief? Would one's religion, would someone's class level, income, like how big of a role does that play?
Frankly, not very big. I mean, if you conventional economics is, to me, it's like Ptolemaic astronomy. Okay. Now, I don't care how good a rocket designer you are. If you believe Ptolemaic astronomy, you're not going to get anything off the ground. So it doesn't matter whether you've got a developed economy or a developing one, whatever state you're in, the mainstream economics is completely misleading. And when you throw it out, you get the things that the economics leave out are money, private bank, debt, energy, and the physical world. Okay, they play no role in the mainstream way of thinking about the economy. So it's we have to get rid of so much stuff to start thinking about the economy sensibly. That's really the dilemma. If you come in from outside, you'll be overwhelmed by it, and that's why I wrote Debunking Economics, because that takes you through a structured approach to economics and shows that it's superficially very convincing and it's fundamentally very wrong.
All right. And if you could, some people similar to myself who would have a very surface level idea of what economics would be compared to someone like yourself, taking maybe a leaf out of, or a page out of Debunking Economics' book, if you could explain for the most intellectual human being listening to this, and equally the dumbest or maybe least interested in economics, one maybe theory or change to present day economics, what would you look to implement, or maybe what would you like to see mentioned or used more?
Well, the one thing that I emphasize is we have to use accounting, which is double entry bookkeeping.
My dad would be happy to hear
Because
that
the
as an
capitalism.
accountant.
Okay, well, capitalism is a monetary system, but neoclassical economists assumed you could treat it as a barter system, okay? And therefore they developed explanations as to why money doesn't really matter. So if you go back and take a look at the work of the proto-neoclassical economist called Jean-Baptiste Say, back in the early 19th century, he argued that capitalists don't try to accumulate money, they simply want to accumulate goods. Now that's nonsense, okay? Capitalists clearly are in the business of accumulating financial wealth. So that's the starting perspective. Said you can ignore the monetary demand, just look at the demand for goods and services. Now that's describing capitalism as a system of petty commodity production. It's completely false about the actual nature of capitalism. What it means is economists have never sat down and worked out the accounting of the monetary system. I built a software package called Ravel that enables you to get an integrated double entry bookkeeping table view of the financial transactions in an economy, whether that's an incredibly stylized model or an extremely detailed model. And when you have that, the monetary system is an absolutely critical part of capitalism. So to understand that, most of the arguments you see people having over economics right now come down to government, whether government should run a deficit. And if you look at the mainstream way of thinking about it, the supply and demand analysis, that tells you that government deficits reduce the supply of money that's available to firms for investment. So a government deficit crowds out investment and causes a lower rate of economic growth, and has an inevitability that government debt will become unsustainable. All those are fallacies when you put them in double entry bookkeeping terms. Okay? The government should run a deficit because that's how you create fiat-backed money. So governments create money by spending more than they get back in taxation, which then turns up as an increase in our bank balances because if they spend more than they take back in taxation, they put more money into bank balances than they take out of bank accounts. And therefore, government spending creates money for the private sector. Now, that's the opposite of what you'll learn if you do supply and demand analysis. So the starting point for me to get people to realize not only how this current system works, but also how mainstream economists are so completely wrong, is just learn the double entry bookkeeping. And your father would know how complicated that is. You've got to know when you put a debit or a credit, on which entry gets a debit or a credit, and make sure there's a debit or credit in every line. I've worked out a simplified way of doing it using what's called the fundamental equation of accounting, that assets minus liabilities equals equity. And that therefore means, so long as you make the sum of assets minus liabilities minus equity to equal zero in every row, you've recorded the transactions properly. So much, much simpler than straight accounting. Your dad maybe not. Your dad would probably be happy to learn that, depending on how old he is.
He's in
Um,
his
uh,
72,
yeah.
73, so he's...
He's retired. He actually might like
Yeah,
a new way to
exactly.
go about it without having to have debits and credits in every line. But yeah, you do that, and all the mainstream ideas about government deficits being dangerous goes out the window. You can see how the private sector accumulate too much debt. The private sector has debt crises. So yeah, that's the first thing, is learn double entry bookkeeping, and see how it applies to economics. And my Ravel software is the best way to see that.
Okay. And with regards to economics, I've sat in some very basic economics lectures in college. I've sat in economic subjects in school when I was younger. And
Mm.
whether it's economics, business, learning music, whatever it may be, there's so many different takes and forms of education these days. And in your opinion, do you feel like, I know you maybe touched on it in the intro, like what do you view as good education when it comes to economics right now, especially maybe for the people who never go through maybe formal academia, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Um, no neoclass, no economic degree is worth doing. Okay, except at a couple of them minor universities. So, like if you're in the UK, Leeds University is pretty good. Bristol University is okay. I wouldn't go near I wouldn't go near Cambridge or Oxford. They'll teach you a mythical view. That's the establishment view. So the higher rank the university, the worse your economic education is going to be. If you wanted to learn a good starting approach, again, this is going to be advertising my own wares here, but the book I wrote that you mentioned in the intro, the New Economics, a Manifesto, that gives a realistic foundation for economic theory based on accounting on one side and complex systems on the other. And the fundamental point that people should start from is capitalism is a complex evolutionary system. And therefore, you need the tools of complexity analysis and evolutionary analysis to understand how it develops. And the economics, which is taught in textbooks, developed before we fully developed knowledge of complex systems, when evolution was barely starting as a concept. And so it's actually like pre-evolutionary, pre-complex systems thinking, and it's completely out of date, and nobody should even bother learning it. So complex systems, and get a copy of the New Economics, the Manifesto.
Okay. I'm sure some of my economic degree holding friends will find that piece rather interesting, or even some of the...
Oh, they'll be offended by it, but I think sorry, you've been taught a set of myths, so it's time you got your brains
Yeah, but the tough
deprogrammed.
love could be required on that. And you're saying
Mm.
change is definitely something that needs to be addressed in the economic world. It's more like you feel like you're ahead of the curve and you're looking back. But one of the big things I do want to delve a little bit into before I forget about it was one of
Mm.
your early claim to fame was around the early 2000s financial crash back in like 2007,
Mm-hmm.
2008. And when you first realized that the crash was coming back in, say, like 2008, you could maybe have a huge amount of factors, but in your view and in your own words, what was the clearest sign to you that everyone else missed? Because not many people saw it coming.
Well, the clearest sign was there was rising levels of private debt compared to GDP. That was it. So the way that my initial work in economics was modeling Minsky's, a guy called Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So I took that verbal argument that Minsky developed and turned it into a mathematical model, basically using complex systems ideas to do that. And what my model generated I first completed the mathematical model in August of 1992, and that was before neoclassical economists started talking about what they called the Great Moderation, which is a period of diminishing cycles in the economy. You had booms and slumps. Booms are getting less extreme, slumps are getting less steep, and the rate of economic growth appeared to be stabilizing. And neoclassical economists thought that was great, and they took credit for it, and they called it the Great Moderation. I generated that as an outcome of my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis in 1992. And what it showed you was a period of diminishing volatility is actually a prelude to a period of increasing volatility and breakdown. So that background was why I was immediately, as soon as I was asked to, well, this is a court case that led to me actually bringing up the warning, because I was hired by a what do you call it, a legal aid group to help out a truck owner, a truck driver who'd had 6 consecutive mortgages fail, and they were trying to prevent the 7th mortgage from being enforced, because he should never have been given those mortgages in the first place. And the only way that a judge will actually agree to overturn a contract is if it has deleterious impacts upon third parties. So that was why I was approached to be the expert witness. And I wrote a throwaway line as I was writing my expert witness report, was that the private debt to GDP ratios have been rising exponentially recently. And I hadn't looked at the data for about a decade, because I finished my PhD about a decade before I was approached to be the expert witness in this court case. So I thought I'd better check the data, because in the Australian legal system, I presume it's the same in the UK, even though you're hired by one side as an expert, you're regarded as an employee of the court. So you can't make hyperbolic statements. You must be able to verify any claim you make. So I went and checked the American data, or the Australian data first of all. Pardon me. I better see. This might be a scam call, so just I'll take a look and see what it is. Hang on a second.
From Indeed Human Resources, I would like to discuss the job with you. Please add my.
Fuck that. Okay, so much for that. Okay. Yeah. So where was I? Yeah, so I they literally wrote the word exponentially. The ratio has been increasing exponentially. And so I better check the data, and then I managed to get Australian data first of all, and then what I saw was that from 1965 to when I wrote the report, which is about 2005, so 40 years, the rate of growth of the private debt to GDP ratio fitted an exponential curve with a ridiculous correlation coefficient, like about 0.99.
Okay.
And I thought, holy hell, this rate of increase of private debt to GDP can't continue. When it breaks, there's going to be a crisis. Somebody has to warn about that, and at least in Australia, I was the somebody. But I also checked the American data. Now, the American data wasn't as strong, but the starting point for their exponential increase in the ratio of private debt to GDP was 1945. So basically, the whole post-war period, the level of private debt has been rising faster than GDP. And I just said, this can't continue indefinitely. When there's a break in the growth of private debt, there'll be a crisis. And the basic idea was that credit will go from being positive to negative. And when it does, that's when the crisis will occur. Well, that's precisely what happened in 2007. In fact, the turn from positive to negative credit began in 2006. The reason I saw it is because of my support of Minsky's hypothesis. Minsky debt played a critical role in Minsky's thinking, private debt. That's why I looked at it, and that's why neoclassical economists ignored it, because according to their theory, private debt is like, sex between consenting adults behind closed doors. Nobody else's business, doesn't affect anybody else. They record the data on credit, but they never look at it. So that's the reason I saw it, and then the ironic thing is, because I became so prominent in Australia, I scared the pants off the Australian government, and they 6 days after I was interviewed on national TV warning about a crisis, they brought in a series of grants to first-home buyers that doubled and trebled the amount of money the government gave first-home buyers, and that restarted the housing bubble, which meant Australia didn't experience a recession. But of course, there was nobody like me in America, and so when the crunch hit, America went from the rate of change of private debt peaking in 2006 at 15% of GDP and falling by 2009 to minus 5% of GDP. That's a 20% of GDP turnaround in the impact of credit on aggregate demand, and that's what caused the crisis. According to neoclassical economists, credit plays no role in aggregate demand. They didn't even look at the data. That's why they didn't see it coming. And they still haven't worked out a decent explanation of the crisis almost 20 years after it occurred.
Yeah, true. Like I went on a bit of a rabbit hole the last month looking at some of the financial crisis documentaries. And what I do find is normally when you look at maybe a true crime or any sort of documentary about something that happened for better or worse, there tends to be common threads and rationale around why it happened or who was responsible. Well, what I found with the financial crash is you had different political parties blaming X and Y, you had different experts saying X and Y, and as you said, it just seemed like nearly let's brush that under the carpet. Let's not really blame the people who maybe should have been blamed even more intensely, and hopefully it doesn't happen again. And that nearly leads me on to my next question. And I've read some speculative pieces over the last maybe year or two where some economists and journalists report that maybe there could be another recession or crash looming. Like, do you see any deja vu signs in present day?
Not particularly, because the level of private debt got to be so extreme that the potential for a crisis. I'm actually bringing up a chart I want to show on screen, by the way, as we talk about this. So the level of private debt exploded under, like I said, it went from America's case, it went from 47% of GDP in 1947 to 170% of GDP in 2008. And the rate of change of debt credit was positive. Like the change in private debt was always positive all the way through from 1947 forward until 2006, when it went from, as I said, more than 15% of GDP to about minus 5% of GDP. Now, we've had a small reduction in private debt since then, but all the mainstream economists have thought, we need to get the private sector borrowing again. So they've actually done things which encourage private debt not to fall. So it hasn't fallen anywhere near as much as it did during the 1930s with the Great Depression. So we've got an overburden of private debt supported by government policy run by people like Ben Bernanke and so on. And that's meant that because you have such a high level of debt, people's willingness to take on more debt is constrained. Banks' willingness to lend is constrained as well. So rather than having a credit boom, which you need to have a credit bust, we've had sort of credit stagnation comparatively, and there hasn't been a great deal of credit-based demand compared to what it was before the crisis. So you're unlikely to get anything serious coming out of it. Can I actually share the screen and just show what I'm talking about?
Yeah, can you share? I think you can share a screen potentially. There's a share button.
I can share the screen here. Let's go. So do the share the entire screen. So this one over here, this is my Ravel software, and this is level of private and government debt in America. And government debt's the one that everybody else all the mainstream focus on. I focus on private debt. You can see this rising level over time. It roughly fits an exponential. I'll show you the Australian just to compare that in a moment. But what it means is the most important element is the black line here, and that's the annual change in private debt as a percentage of GDP. You can see that most of the time it was bouncing around 5% back in the 50s, hitting 10% in the 60s and 70s. Then it peaks just before the financial crisis began, at about 16% of GDP. The green line there is August of 2007. That's when the BNP shut down 3 of its subprime funds, so saying we won't let withdrawals from it. That's the date that's regarded as start of the crisis. So you go from it being 15% of GDP down to -5, and the red line that I'm showing there is the unemployment rate. And you can see they're basically mirror images of each other, and that's through the higher level of private debt you get. So that was what I was looking at. That's why I've got an explanation. The neoclassicals are still struggling to find some sort of explanation. They don't even look at this data, and that shows why I said it's like a Ptolemaic astronomer. A Ptolemaic astronomer would never look at the gravity calculations to explain why a meteor took out the let's say St. Peter's Basilica. I'll actually quickly show Australia's data here, and just show you what I'm looking at in terms of what did and didn't happen. So the exponential increase in debt is more obvious for Australia over that time period. And we hit a peak in 2007 like everybody else, but the government then encouraged the private sector to continue borrowing again, so it recontinued. And you look at the rate of change of debt, credit was over 20% of GDP for Australia before the financial crisis hit, but it never fell below 4% of GDP. And what that meant was you got a credit-based revival in the Australian economy. It didn't have the high unemployment the rest of the world got. They patted themselves on the back on it, but what it caused was the continuing housing bubble. And one major reason why housing is unaffordable is most of the debt that's been taken on in the last 20 years has driven up house prices. It's been mortgage debt. It hasn't been productive debt borrowing by corporations to invest. So that's the state of the nation. That's why I can quite confidently claim that I saw the crisis coming and identified the cause. Neoclassicals are still struggling to explain why it happened 20 years after the event.
And even for a basic observer like myself, it's even intriguing and interesting to see how the correlation between both those graphs mirror each other, as you said. So it's like without the other fails and vice versa. Like the two of them were working in tandem to create this eventual, I suppose, economical meltdown of sorts. And you talk a lot about debt, and one thing I hear my dad say, I hear some of my friends who work in the financial / economic side of society, is the world as a whole. I think the most latest report is like $300 trillion in debt is what planet Earth is currently looking at. So for someone who isn't exactly the sharpest tool on planet Earth, like how does that amount of money end up being in the red? And I suppose that's obviously, as you've suggested, been going on for years, decades. How have we gotten to that $300 trillion in debt as a globe?
Well, for starters, it's a mistaken classification. Okay, but people look at that amount, they're adding up government debt and private debt. Okay. Now, private debt is a worry. If you don't have cash flow coming in and you've got debt to service, you can go bankrupt. That's a private dilemma. The government debt, as it's called, is actually government bonds, okay, which are sold initially by the government to the private banks. It doesn't involve any borrowing of money. In fact, the bonds are paid for not with money, but what we call reserves. Okay, and so the classic the classic mistake that neoclassical economists make is to imagine the government is borrowing like everybody else. Okay, the government doesn't borrow its own currency. Okay, it's like saying I've got a printing press and I'm going to go borrow some money that I could make with a printing press. Why would you be such an idiot? Okay, but that's people talk. Government printing press goes brrr. They'll say that all the time, and then they imagine the government's borrowing the money it's just created. Get your fucking story straight, okay? This is part of the frustration I cope. The government's in too much debt and it can print money. Those two things don't go together, okay? It's just insane how many stupid conventions exist in mainstream thought. And the reason they're stupid, they continue persisting, is it's just like we still believe that the Earth was the center of the universe and that there are epicycles and equants that explain the movement of the planets. And we're all fiddling with these stupid models that are completely wrong about the structure of the solar system. Economics is still in the same state. So that means people can end up with ludicrous explanations. One explanation, government printer goes brr, explaining inflation, and then government's in debt, which means the government's borrowing money that it just printed. Get your fucking story straight, okay? This is why I get so frustrated dealing with people, not just the public who don't know the background, but particularly mainstream economists who think they're espousing wisdom. And it's the wisdom at the epicycles and the equants. They've got an explanation for capitalism, which is about as accurate as Ptolemy's explanation for the solar system.
Okay, fair enough. And one of the the last things I want to ask, maybe about more of the global side of the economic state at the moment. It'd be nearly ignorant for me not to ask about what has happened in the last maybe 2 years, because I feel like politics has such a huge impact on the financial / economic side of countries' well-beings, but also across the world, whether it's, the current wars going on, the uncertainty, even Donald Trump's tariffs. And that's kind of where I want to ask a question, in your opinion, like what type of impact has Trump's, I know it's a short term at the moment, but like what type of impact has his presidency had on modern day economics around the world? Do you think it's been better?
He's making a mess of the joint. I mean, there's no way that Trump is dedicated to cutting the deficit. I think this is what Musk was obviously dedicated to that, and it's a stupid bloody idea. That's why I wrote a book. I've just self-published. I might actually bring that up on screen as well, because it's available on Amazon. But most people, it's sold amongst my own reading group, but it hasn't got much further than that. And I called that book "Money and Macroeconomics from First Principles" for Elon Musk and other engineers. So
Yeah,
I'll just
absolutely.
quickly go and share that. Okay. So that's the cover of the. Hang on a second. That's the cover of the book. Okay. So he claims to be an engineer, but whether he is or isn't, that's another story. But that's the cover. And what I go through and show is that from an engineering point of view, if you work from engineering first principles, you get a totally different view of the economy to what the mainstream pumps out. So supply and demand equilibrium, that's garbage. Capitalism is a far from equilibrium system. Its dynamics are those of a complex system which never reaches its equilibria because they're unstable. But that's part of where the creativity of capitalism comes from. The fact that you could actually describe the most dynamically evolutionary human civilization possibly in existence ever as being an equilibrium shows you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, equilibrium never happens. So we have a range of fallacies and farces that people base their thinking on, and they, in that sense, thinking in equilibrium terms is an anti-evolutionary idea. And therefore, you can't see the evolution that's taking place all around you because you imagine everything is in equilibrium.
Okay. And then just even to maybe dig a little bit deeper on it, like if you were to have, you may not want to have 2 minutes with Donald Trump, but if you were to tell him to focus on one thing that you feel like could be changed, especially maybe in the US economy, as a lot does stream from that, what would you tell him to focus on?
Well, what he's trying to do is the right thing. Okay, he's trying to revive. He claims he's trying to revive manufacturing, and the thing which America has undermined for the last, ever since the Second World War, is its manufacturing sector, and it's undermined in two ways. If you're the reserve currency, then your currency is overvalued, which means it's great for the financial sector, which can go and buy assets in the rest of the world with inflated American dollars. But it's disastrous for the manufacturing sector that has to compete against countries which get a 20 or 30% advantage over you just because of the exchange rate. So that over time has diminished America's manufacturing capability. But that's what led it to being a world power in the first place. So it's destroyed the foundations of its own world power. And that's where the redneck Republicans have come from. People who used to have decent working class jobs in factories now finding themselves unemployed or on welfare or working in the gig economy, and they're angry, and they basically threw Trump as a human hand grenade into Washington. So he's actually working on their justified complaints, the lack of manufacturing, lack of skilled jobs, precarious situation they find themselves in financially. So he's following on those things, but what he's doing has got bugger all relationship to what's going to work there. So slapping on tariffs and taking them back on again, people are going to be looking at that and saying, I'm going to wait 4 years until this settles down before I invest. So rather than leading to investment, it's likely to be preventing investment. The ICE raid on that Hyundai factory, you would have seen that where they arrested a whole bunch of Korean Okay. Now, they may have stuffed out their bloody form to get into the country. They probably do what they've done dozens of times beforehand. Now Trump actually enforces those laws. So you get, a couple of hundred Koreans finding themselves in jail, and they're Korean nationals out here to build a factory. Hyundai's decided not to go ahead with that factory. So that's $4 billion of investment just went up in smoke, courtesy of Trump's heavy-handed stuff on immigration. So, in that sense, what he's doing that's sensible is trying to revive manufacturing. The way he's doing it, I believe, is just persuading people, let's just wait till he's out of the way before we try doing any investing. And that's going to undermine the economy. Equally, the raids that are hitting undocumented migrants, they're the backbone of the agricultural sector. They're the people who pick the plants. We're likely to see food prices skyrocket because food availability is going to decline, because they're now afraid of going to work, because if they go to work, they might get arrested by ICE. So you're destroying the manufacturing capability and certainly the agricultural productive capability of the economy. It'll stumble through, but it's hardly encouraging productivity and innovation to go about it the way Trump is going about it.
Yeah, it's definitely, and you rightfully pinpointed, it's maybe 2 steps forward and 3 steps back in a lot of those instances, and especially around the policies around some of these factory workers being deported or even in worse situations being put in prison. And to divert my attention from the United States to my little island here of Ireland, and you've touched on it about GDP. Like Ireland, for instance, has high GDP per capita, but like issues like our housing remain an absolute, excuse my French, shit show. Cost of living is hurting the majority of our nation. Inequality and immigration issues on top of that are kind of underlining a lot of the unease towards maybe our politicians at the moment. And like in Ireland, the average house prices, just to give you a stat, they're now like 8 times the average household income. So like it's not adding up. While if you compare that to the healthy ratio of 3 times, we seem to be way off. So from your perspective, what do you think? And you might, as I said, it might be me asking too much of you, but like, what do you think is the biggest maybe structural vulnerability in Ireland's economy, and what maybe basic principle or policy would you propose to strengthen its resilience towards these issues?
Well, again, Ireland was the poster. You used to be called the Celtic Tiger.
I
do you remember that? Okay. Now, what you were doing was you were borrowing like bloody crazy. So again, I'm going to share a chart here and show this is, again, my Ravel software is showing Irish data now. And you can see your Irish debt level from the data only goes back to 1960, 1970 by the looks of that. But private debt all the way through 1996, always below 100% of GDP. Then this massive blowout to let's look at the financial crisis itself. You went through there with 239% of GDP. You then various ups and downs elsewhere. Ultimately, a ratio of 400%. I just don't use Irish data because there's so many fakes inside there, because a lot of that debt's debt owned by American corporations that are taking advantage of your tax loopholes. But that's where your bubble began. Take a look at the relationship between unemployment and credit. Unemployment, you had 16% unemployment back in the 1990s, and all the things you would have blamed that on plunged down to about 4%, which is when you've been called the Irish, the Celtic Tiger, and then bang, this explosion here again when credit went from positive to negative. So again, you were a poster child of a housing bubble, and the housing bubble is driven by too much private debt. So I've actually got analysis of that as well. This is a bit of a messy chart here, but you can see that when you take a look at what causes changes in house prices, this is Australian data, what causes house prices to rise is acceleration in mortgage debt. Let's just take a look at the Irish data here. Looks like I haven't got Ireland going back there. I've cut Ireland out of the data because I wanted stuff going back to 1970 in this particular. I can't actually show the Irish data there. But basically, you had a huge mortgage bubble. That what gave you the prosperity. You built tons of houses, which are now derelict. It was all a housing bubble financed by mortgage debt. And that's the mistake. We should never let banks lend as much as they do for housing. That's what I'll show you. I can show you the UK data, which is close enough. I know you guys don't like being compared to the UK,
No,
but let's
but
take
at
a
least
look
you
anyway.
appreciated that.
Okay. Yeah. So what you can see is this housing debt in the UK used to be about the total private. This is household debt used to be about 100% of GDP. 30%. This is over this side. 30% of GDP rose to 100%, which gave you the booming house prices, and then now it's coming down. And when you look at what's driving the whole relationship, change in house prices is driven by acceleration in mortgage debt. It's clearest. It's actually clearer when you take a look at the American data and the Spanish data, but the same basic causing factor. All you get out of letting banks decide how much to lend to housing is they cause housing bubbles, which make housing unaffordable. So I've got to get banks out of mortgage lending. Go back to the days when the UK used used building societies. I'll just show the US data just to show how strong this relationship is here. So when you want to see what's actually causing the ups and downs of house prices, it's the ups and downs of new credit for housing. So by letting the banks decide how much to lend, that's what made housing unaffordable. And we've got to get household mortgage debt out of house prices if we can. But of course, that's not going to happen. We'll be stuck with this till the cows come home, I'm afraid.
Okay. Positivity awaits me ahead of
Sorry about that.
my first mortgage down the line.
I'm telling you, the people running the ship, they've got madmen at the wheel of the Titanic. Yeah. That's the real problem you face. So, you want to be sugar-coated?
No,
forget it.
I'd actually blame you if you went another direction and tried to put candy floss on top of it. But with the one narrative that really annoys me, and I do hear it from some of my family members and friends, where they're like, "Oh, well, Ireland's booming, and we're such a rich country, and we've got all these multinationals, blah blah blah." But like, as you rightfully pinpointed there, it's like, well, we'll still, just as a normal human being trying to live and buy houses, it's exceptionally difficult at the moment, and that's why people need 2 or 3 jobs just to ultimately survive. But do you think the way we measure success in countries like GDP is somewhat misleading? And if so, like, what would you actually do to replace it with?
Well, the funny thing is GDP is actually an extremely accurate measure of how much energy we're using. So, and this again is something mainstream economics completely ignores. They don't have any role for energy in their so-called production functions, so they don't even know this data exists. But if you take a look at the change in energy and change in gross world output, so not just domestic but gross world output, fundamentally what gross world product is energy turned into useful work. The correlation between change in energy and change in gross world product is about 0.88 over a 40-year period. So basically rising GDP, which is the domestic version of GWP, is rising energy consumption.
Okay.
So that's the basic driving force you've got there. So in that sense, it's an extremely good measure of how much energy we're using. People give the example and say, look, it's terrible with GDP. If you have a car accident, that adds to GDP. Yes, it does. Simple reason. You've got to pull the 2 cars apart. That takes the energy of the forklift driver. You've got to move them back to be serviced. That takes the energy of the forklift truck. The victims go to hospital. That requires energy in the hospital itself. So GDP is actually an extremely good measure of the amount of energy we're consuming. So that's realistic, but it's got bugger all to do with welfare. What gives you welfare is what the energy is used for and who gets to use it. And the inequality we've got means that the wealthy are the main beneficiaries of that energy consumption, and the rest of us don't see much of it at all. So it's, again, there's so many fallacies in how people think about the economy without even being aware they're fallacies, because it's what they get taught by textbooks and they see in newspapers and media coverage, and therefore we know about as much about the economy as people did about the solar system in the 1500s.
Okay, so work to do on that front. And with
Mm.
this is probably the last question I will cover with you, and then I do finish with some quick fire questions, which will fly through. But I work in the tech industry in sales, and whether I pick up a newspaper, whether I'm online, whether I'm reading comments even on threads, AI is the buzzword that everyone and everything is mentioning right now. And especially in my industry, some people think it might create more jobs, others think it will get rid of loads. And like recent reports, I think suggested like nearly 50% of US jobs could be automated in the next 20 years. In your view, and this is quite a broad question, so feel free to take it wherever you feel like it needs to go, like how pivotal will AI's role be in our economic futures, whether it's a specific place or even from a global scale?
Well, the main thing I focus on is robotics. Okay, and the reason that manual jobs exist is because it's been impossible to automate them in the past. Now that we've got robots and we're developing the dexterity of their, their hands, to use a bit of a human term, the more dexterous they get, the easier they can replace virtually any unskilled manufacturing job. So unskilled labor is going to disappear. Particularly factory unskilled labor, but many other elements as well. There's a whole lot of middle-class bureaucratic jobs inside companies which can be replaced with AI. So it's going to threaten the capacity of people to get wages, because part of why we got wages paid when you didn't own capital is because you needed workers to complete the production process. When you don't need them, that sort of bargaining disappears. And quite a few of the tech world people are talking in terms of needing a universal basic income, and that's actually correct. If you're going to eliminate potential employment for half the population, then you eliminate income for half the population. And if you do that, you don't end up in a decent society, you end up in the Hunger Games. So the way to avoid that is say, well, we have to provide people with enough to live on, given how productive the system can be without human labor going into it. We then provide people with enough to be able to survive the outputs of the factories. But if you want to make a fortune, then you've got to become an entrepreneur. You can't get it on a universal basic income. But something of that nature is going to be necessary. I also think a lot of AI is a complete bubble, because the AI, large language models are not intelligent. Okay, they can feign intelligence, but they're not true intelligence. And the AI that I'd be interested in is not artificial intelligence, but artificial imagination. And I think we're miles away from being able to work out how that can actually be created in computing as opposed to in our own brains. So I think a lot of it's overhyped, and the energy, I think it's a financially huge bubble as well. People are using, ChatGPT to write, to develop mini movies of their, still photographs from 20 years ago. That's costing a bomb. And I think there's going to be far less profitability in AI than people factored in. So I expect a boom and a bust out of that. But fundamentally, because AI will be what powers robotics, and robotics mean that you can basically eliminate unskilled process workers, it's going to have a huge impact on society over time. And the only way to survive that impact is that we bring in a universal basic income at a decent standard of living. Otherwise, we'll end up in the sort of society we see portrayed in the Hunger Games.
Yeah, no, I do agree, and I do think the imagination side of it, there is still as I said, that robotic nature to AI that doesn't necessarily sit well with me. Where hypothetically, if I was like, "Oh, I'm getting Steve Keen on the podcast, write me out 15 questions and 5 short, quick fire questions," people listening who have listened to my podcast for 8, 9 years, they'll be like, Richie doesn't normally ask questions in that manner. So, and I can't necessarily get ChatGPT to be like, do it in a Richie Allen type way. I'm not exactly Joe Rogan. So I do feel like that lack of personality, that lack, as you said, maybe the imagination side, that gray area where sometimes things get good, sometimes things get a bit messy. That element is definitely lacking in AI. And to be honest with you, I don't know. I can't agree or disagree with you saying it might have a short lifespan in relation to it might like burst in a year, 2 years. Like Nvidia stockholders probably are praying that you could be wrong on that, but it is definitely something that does feel fickle. It doesn't feel very solid. Like, oh yeah, this will be here in definitely 15, 20 years, or there won't be a better version than this. So it will be, in my opinion anyway, especially for the next maybe 5 years, absolutely fascinating to see how it goes.
I can see a stock market bubble bursting in the next year or two over AI, because there's, the costs are enormous. If you got to restart 3 Mile Island because you need the energy for a data center, then you bloody better make money out of it, or that's going to bankrupt you. So I think a lot of companies which are riding high in AI are going to come crashing down. But the fundamental capacity of AI to take over semi-unskilled labour positions and automate a huge amount of production. Also, there'll be domestic servant robots as well, which will do, as good a job as Manuel in Faulty Towers, if not better. So that's going to work for a lot of people, and we're likely to get them. I hate the thought of this, but it's going to turn up in the military. Okay, and also possibly personal armies. So I certainly see it as transformative, but the extent to which people are expecting a profit out of letting people animate their old still photographs in the 1970s, I can't see that being profitable. So I can see a few companies going down in the classic overhyped bubble way that capitalism has always generated.
Okay, fair enough. And yeah, so how I finish these podcasts, it's on a light enough note, depending on obviously where people take them, but it's just a few quick fire questions, and I normally fire them out about certain things. So feel free to say and speak whatever comes to your mind. But first up, I have your favorite film about the financial crash.
The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Renegade Inc. Okay. That's the best one. In fact, the producers of that met me after the show, and they said they're very sorry they didn't meet me before the show. But that's Ross Ashcroft, who unfortunately is no longer with us. Ross died a year or so ago. And Megan Ashcroft, who put together the Renegade Inc. It used to be a great show in Russia Today. When that got shut down, that destroyed their livelihood and destroyed the show as well. But if you want to go to a good, not as good as I would have liked it to be, but better than any other, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Renegade Inc., which you can find on YouTube.
Well, I'll surf for that after this thing, and anyone who's interested, just Spotify, YouTube, I'll attach the link below so people can binge on that whenever they want. And next up, the best book you've ever read.
Period?
Yeah.
The best book I've ever read? In fiction, I'd actually say it's an Ursula Le Guin book called The Dispossessed. That gave it was one of the advantages of sci-fi is that it doesn't have to be talking about, Star Wars and Chewbacca and nonsense like that. You can actually set up a social system, social contrast that doesn't exist in the modern world, but because you've made a future world, it sort of works. So Ursula Le Guin set up a world where there was a capitalist and a socialist nation in continuous conflict with each other, and a developing region as well, much like the Earth. But she had the planet that was called Uras, great name for a planet, Uras. Yeah. I think I can actually work that one out. But it was orbited by a moon called Anares, and Anares happened to have an essential input to the production processes on Uras. And an anarchist revolution led to an anarchist society being given the choice of going to Anares to avoid conflict on the planet. And then they developed their own alternative approach to physics, which led to the capacity to communicate with other solar systems. And it was a beautiful explanation of the failings, not just of a capitalist or a socialist system, but also of a perfect anarchist one, because the anarchist society ended up with its own conventions and ended up oppressing one of the main thinkers in the system. So, be careful what you wish for is the message of the Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. And I think it's a brilliant book. And in terms of fiction books, that's my favorite. In terms of non-fiction, another book you probably haven't heard of, I'll give a bit of a story here. The author of the book is a guy called John Blatt. He was professor of mathematics at New South Wales University, and a notoriously rude human being. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics twice in the 1950s because he wrote the fundamental reference on quantum mechanics at the time. And at the same university he was working at, with the University of New South Wales, there was an economist who was nominated once for the Nobel Prize called I've suddenly forgotten his name, but Morris. It'll come to me. But anyway, he was a friend of mine. I used to play tennis with him, and he, because he regarded himself as the leading economist at New South Wales Uni, having been nominated for the Nobel Prize, he invited John along to one of his seminars. Murray Kemp is his name. So Murray invited John to sit in and hear his lecture on international trade theory. And when he finished, Murray spoke over the head of the other members of the seminar. John was in the back row, I believe. I wasn't there. I was told this by my PhD supervisor. So Murray asked John what he thought. And John's answer was, "That is the greatest load of rubbish I've sat through in my academic career. If this is advanced economics, there's something seriously wrong with economics. I intend finding out what it is. Good day." And he walked out of the room. Okay. Now, he then spent several years doing incredibly deep research into economic theory, going right back to the pre-classical economists, physiocrats and mercantilists and so on, and then rewrote it from the point of view of a gifted applied mathematician. That book's called Dynamic Economic Systems, a post-Keynesian approach is the subtitle. So John Blatt, Dynamic Economic Systems. I'm proud to say that it was out of print when I first discovered it. He died a few years before I started doing my PhD, and the book was out of print. It's now been re-released. So I think I played a major role in that being re-released. That's probably my favorite non-fiction book. So Dynamic Economic Systems by John Blatt, and The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin.
Okay, interesting. You're a good salesman, because now I'm like, Jesus, I think next time I'm online, I think those two, whether I love them or hate them, I definitely need to give them a go anyway. And
definitely.
Next up is the best concert you've ever been to.
Well, there's a few nominations for that. I've been to see Dire Straits, Sting, Simon and Garfunkel. I managed to catch most of my heroes. I saw Paul McCartney with my then girlfriend's brother, who was almost a spitting image of McCartney. He actually acknowledged him from the audience. But in terms of sheer fun for a concert, possibly one, a band called King Crimson. Was the support act, and it completely outshined the lead act, who was not Bob Marley, but one of the fairly famous reggae singers from Cuba or Latin America. So King Crimson completely outdid the imports, and that's probably my favorite concept. King Crimson as a support act to, I forgot his name, but some pretentious reggae guy from the Caribbean.
Fair enough. And do you prefer writing, teaching, or debating?
I suppose writing, because there's such a need for a revised approach to economics that I've ended up having far more impact than I ever thought I would have. I thought I'd be communicating other people's ideas rather than making original contributions, but I've made original contributions in there. And that comes from reading carefully. So I read the literature and I check and see, how do you verify that claim? And then as a consequence of that, I've found enormous holes in mainstream economics and Marxian economics for that reason. So without the writing, I wouldn't have done the teaching. So it's the reading and researching that I find most creative for myself.
Okay. And which country's economy do you admire most right now? And maybe if you could give us 30 seconds as to why.
I went to China in 81, 82, and I saw the state of industry in the aftermath of the Mao period and Madame Mao and so on. And totally primitive industry, very backward production techniques and so on. 40 years later, it's probably the most advanced economy on the planet, I think, certainly somewhere to live. People's incomes, per capita incomes, have risen in China at a rate of about 8% per annum. which is 5 or 6 times as fast as they've risen in the UK or America. And that means that every 45 years, incomes in China, in Australia, in UK or America will double in per capita terms. China, 45 years, it increased by a factor of 64. So, in terms of a successful improvement in the physical living standards of the mass of their population, plus the technological advances they've made, and I think their preparedness for what's coming with global warming, China wins hands down.
Well put. And second last one is, what is the worst house chore to do? Hoovering, cleaning the dishes, or changing the bed sheets?
The dishes, I suppose, but that's we automate everything. I mean, the thing if you look at where our wealth comes from, we find ways of using external energy rather than human energy to do things like vacuuming. So I've got a vacuum machine that runs over the floors itself these days. Dishwashers take over the washing process. Changing sheets, if we need a robot.
We need an AI bed sheet fixer. So have you answered the question by saying the one that isn't automated to a certain degree?
Well, I suppose the one you can't automate at the moment, the robot, that'll go soon. But I've got a feeling we won't get any robots before the whole thing comes crashing down around us. So it'll be the wealthy who get the robots to fix the beds, and then they've got to hope the power stations continue working.
And last question before I let you go: if you could ask yourself a question that I haven't asked you yet today, what would it be? It can be anything, by the way. I've had some very intellectually stimulating questions to some of the most...
Okay, how long will capitalism survive?
Okay. And I'm going to steal that question from you and now ask it in return as my final question on this podcast.
I think we're lucky the last 10 years. Not because of capitalism itself, again, because of economists, because neoclassical economists regarded the limits to growth study back in the 1970s as a challenge to their approach to economics. So they disparaged and threw it out and replaced it with their own garbage. William Nordhaus is the original person that did that. The shit that they put together is the worst research I've ever seen in my bloody life. That includes what I was taught in kindergarten. It should never have been published, but because politicians have taken it seriously, because they always trust economists, a huge mistake. We've done bugger all about global warming. The economists have told us that it's only going to damage us in 2 or 3 centuries hence, and the damage is going to be trivial. That's completely misleading. Reality is going to slap us in the face, and if we're lucky, we'll get away with 10 years before the productive system starts to collapse from the impact of a changing climate. I hope I'm wrong. I'm not a climate scientist specialist, obviously, but I read the climate scientists, I work with them, and those that know what economists have done are horrified and terrified, but they can't get the word out. If we're lucky, capitalism will survive till I die. And I can see no chance of it surviving while you're still alive.
Okay, well, maybe I was going to suggest some crazy AI thing would be able to send people who have passed on some sort of information, but I'm not that far-fetched in my thoughts. But with regards to the podcast, Steve, I just want to thank you for coming on, sharing. It's been very in-depth, exactly what I was after. I'm sure a lot of my listeners who are engaged in this stuff will have a ton to take from it, and they'll probably pothole me with some questions, so I might have to forward some on. And yeah, I suppose lastly, I'll attach any information around your socials and Substack and whatnot, but is there any bits and bobs you'd like to mention?
Yeah, the main thing, my Substack and Patreon are my main sources of income, and it's also where I put my views out there for free because there's so much misinformation on economics that I want to make it possibly accessible. I don't want to put it behind paywalls. So Substack and Patreon. Find me there as Prof. Steve Keen. YouTube, thank Christ. I lost my YouTube channel 2 days ago. It's coming back. I'll probably be air again, and hopefully by tomorrow or Sunday. So Prof. Steve Keen on YouTube. And I now give a set of online courses. The marketing will make you cringe. It makes me cringe occasionally, but it's genuine, and you get to being a course with me. So if you go look for stevekeen.com, then that'll give you the input into the course. And there's about 800 people have signed up so far. And it's a fabulous bunch of people. I'm learning a lot from them. They're learning a damn sight more from me, but it's definitely mutual results. So stevekeen.com, sign up there. And if you want to learn economics in detail with the obviously skeptical framework that I come with, that's my major recommendation. So Substack, Patreon, and stevekeen.com.
Well, I'll attach all them below in the bio, so feel free to click on that and get going if you're interested. So with all that said, Steve, I just want to thank you again. Wish you all the best in your battle in the economic landscape, and hopefully in maybe 10 years we can have a reunion on this podcast and you can be able to look back about AI and some of the stuff we covered and say, I told you so.
Well, we'll wait and see. 10 years is pushing my luck. We'll see how we go.
Anyway, Thanks, Steve.